The 16-year-old's body was found at the Flying G Ranch near Deckers, where she was attending Girl Scout camp.
Number 10. Lindy Sue Biechler.
Lindy Sue Biechler was on the minds of many throughout the years. Certainly, law enforcement has never forgotten about her.
The aunt and uncle of Lindy Sue Biechler stopped by her apartment on December 5, 1975 to exchange some recipes. What they found was Biechler dead in her own home, having been stabbed to death by an unknown assailant. And no, it was not the husband. DNA was taken from Biechler's clothing, but technological limitations prevented it from being tested. This DNA was run through genetic genealogy testing, which sourced it to a 68-year-old man named David Sinopoli. Investigators trailed Sinopoli and grabbed his DNA from a discarded coffee cup, matching it to the DNA found on Biechler. He was arrested in July 2022, over 46 years after the killing occurred.
He was handcuffed and shackled. He sat expressionless in the courtroom.
Number 9. Jewel Langford.
Until now, authorities kept their discovery a secret as they worked with the FBI to identify a suspect.
It was May 3, 1975, when the remains of a woman were found in Ontario's Nation River. She had been strangled with a cable, and her hands and ankles had been bound, indicating obvious foul play. No one knew who the woman was, and it remained a mystery for nearly 5 decades. Shortly before the remains were found, a Tennessee woman named Jewel Langford was reported missing after she failed to return from a trip to Montreal.
In 2020, police identified the Nation River lady as Jewel Parchman Langford, a prominent 48-year-old businesswoman from Tennessee who'd gone missing in 1975.
The case would remain cold until 2019, when genetic genealogy was used to match the Nation River lady's DNA with some close relatives. It was found to be the long-missing Langford, and a man named Rodney Nichols was finally charged with her murder in 2022.
We were told that it was a match, and that we finally knew where she was.
Number 8. Wendy Joe Henderson. It's terrifying to think that a simple trip to the drugstore could be your last. During one afternoon in 1968, LA resident Wendy Joe Henderson drove to Thrifty to buy a hairdryer. Witnesses saw Henderson in the store, confirming she had made the trip. But she never returned home. Her family tragically didn't have to wait long to find out what happened, as Henderson's car was found the next day with her body in the trunk. Her death remained a mystery until 2017, when DNA proved that she was killed by a man named Edwin Dean Richardson. Unfortunately, Richardson had died in 2013 while serving time in prison for another murder. So, he never faced justice for the killing of young Henderson. Number 7. Susan Galvin. It's always bittersweet when a cold case is finally cracked but the killer is long dead. The story of Susan Galvin dates back to July 1967, when she was strangled inside the Seattle Center Entertainment Complex. The police dusted for prints and collected her clothes as evidence, but the case went cold and remained cold until 2019.
Police worked the streets, interviewed dozens of people, but Galvin's case would turn cold.
DNA found on Galvin's clothes was sent to a genealogy service which traced it to a specific family tree. Investigators then traced this tree down to a man named Frank Whippich. Unfortunately, Whippich had been dead since 1987. However, police exhumed his remains and matched his DNA to Galvin's clothes, closing the case after 52 years.
The DNA in his bones were a match to the DNA found on Galvin.
Number 6. Everett Delano.
Everett Delano was shot and killed during a robbery in an auto repair shop in central New Hampshire.
Sanborn Auto Body in Andover, New Hampshire was the scene of a violent robbery on September 1, 1966. During the incident, a 49-year-old Navy veteran named Everett Delano was shot 3 times in the head. Police didn't have much to go on, aside from some fingerprints found on a running faucet. Unfortunately, the technology needed to match the prints just wasn't there in 1966, but it was in 2013, when a new test sourced the fingerprints to one Thomas Cass, a part-time employee of the body shop. Cass was interviewed by the police in relation to the murder and took his own life shortly after.
He changed his will, he made arrangements, so he's clearly very concerned that he was going to be arrested for this homicide.
In February 2019, investigators closed the case after 52 years. Number 5. Margaret Beck.
She was loving and protective of her family, and we will cherish the memories we have of her forever.
One morning in the summer of 1963, the bunkmate of Margaret Beck noticed that Beck was not at breakfast. The two were serving as counselors at Flying G Ranch Girl Scouts camp near Deckers, Colorado. She returned to their bunk and found Beck dead, having obviously been killed by an unseen assailant.
The 16-year-old's body was found at the Flying G Ranch near Deckers, where she was attending Girl Scout camp.
The assailant remained unseen, and the case went nowhere until April 2020. That's when genetic genealogy linked the DNA found under Beck's fingernails to one James Raymond Taylor. Taylor worked as a TV repairman in the 1960s, but disappeared from recorded history the next decade. He was last seen in Las Vegas in 1976, and investigators were unable to track him down for questioning.
And this is a painful time for them to have this wound reopened.
Number 4, Maurice Chivarella.
Even though it took nearly 58 years for this case to be solved, I think that this should instill in the families of victims across the state and across the country a sense of hope.
As we see throughout this list, genealogy plays a major role in solving cold cases. This particular case dates back to March 1964. A man and his nephew stumbled upon a body in a coal pit. It belonged to a local student named Maurice Chivarella, who had failed to arrive at school that day. The case went cold until 2018, when investigators used a genealogy company to source the DNA found on Chivarella's clothing.
The state police unveiled these images of a possible suspect at various ages, 25, 40, and 60.
This DNA was eventually traced to a man named James Fort, a bartender who had lived just a few blocks from Chivarella. He was identified as the killer in February 2022, almost 58 years later. Unfortunately, Fort died in 1980.
It gives us a sense of closure. Not full closure, we'll never have that, but a sense of closure that we know the individual that did it.
Number 3, Irene Garza.
All of us go to the church together. Her car is still parked there. What happened?
On April 16, 1960, Garza told her parents that she was going to confession at her local McAllen, Texas church. Her body was found in a canal 5 days later. Suspicion immediately fell on the priest who heard Garza's confession, a man named John Fite. But he was never charged and left the priesthood in the 1970s.
John Fite was trying to stay 2 steps ahead of everybody. He told the authorities that he goes by Whataburger and starts driving aimlessly.
It remained an open case until 2002, when 2 clergymen came forth, claiming that Fite had confessed his involvement to them. This kick-started a lengthy criminal process that finally ended in 2016 with the arrest of Fite, who was then 83 years old. He was found guilty in 2017, ending the mystery after 57 years.
It had taken a jury in a predominantly Catholic region just 6 hours to convict a former priest of murder.
Number 2, Patricia Kalitsky and Dwayne Bogle.
On the evening of January 2nd, Kalitsky, a junior at Great Falls High, and her boyfriend Dwayne Bogle, a Malmstrom airman, ventured to a spot west of Great Falls near Wadsworth Park along the Sun River.
Back in 1956, the double homicide of Patricia Kalitsky and Dwayne Bogle could not be cracked. In January of that year, the bodies of Kalitsky and Bogle were found north of Great Falls, Montana. Despite some valiant efforts, the case went nowhere until 2019, when DNA evidence found on Kalitsky's body was tested. Using genetic genealogy, they traced it to one Kenneth Gould, and received a match after testing the DNA of Gould's children.
Although Gould died in 2007, his body was cremated and his children consented to submitting DNA samples, resulting in a match.
Gould had no personal connection to either Kalitsky or Bogle, but he often rode horses through the area in which they were found. Investigators closed the case in 2021 after 65 long years, but Gould evaded justice, having died back in 2007.
His widow and one of her daughters still live in Alton, still coming to grips with the startling revelation.
Dalbert Aposhian. The fact that this case remained unsolved for 72 years is baffling, considering the San Diego Sheriff's Department had essentially cracked it pretty much right away. In July 1933, the body of Dalbert Aposhian was found in San Diego Bay. The city became hysterical, believing that Aposhian was the victim of a serial killer. Meanwhile, a kid named Jack Confer told investigators that he was fishing with Aposhian when the boy fell into the water. The sheriff's department believed him, but others did not, having been swayed and influenced by the lurid stories. The case was finally solved in 2005 by Detective Kurt Goldberg and Dr. John Lucas, who proved that Aposyan had indeed drowned and that his awful injuries were the result of fish. Will cold cases become easier to solve in the future? Let us know what you think in the comments below.
Now, there is a chance the person who committed these crimes is someone from this town. Possibly even someone you know.
Check out these other clips from WatchMojo, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.